to, and it's just all the pews are there. There's a small stage, and that's it. There doesn't seem to be much more room, at least where the service is. So it doesn't look like to be a very large church at all. So you could imagine this was their busiest day. The church closed for much of the week. Today, on Sunday, though, they had services, according to their Facebook page. They're open from 8:15 to noon, and then from 5 to 6. And they're usually, this was their day where people in that small community can come there to obviously pray and to worship and to be together. Right now, we know that the special agents from the ATF's Houston Field Division, as well as from the San Antonio Division, are also on scene. The FBI just minutes ago just pushing people back and reporters back away from the scene as they obviously try to get a sense of well, just try to make room and just try to get a sense of what's going on. We know that the shooter is dead. We know that there are multiple fatalities. And right now it seems that this is all about these families just trying to get a hold of their loved ones and figuring out how they're doing.
Absolutely,
and
Brian.
That's what this is about right now.
Yeah, it's the unthinkable nightmare happening on a Sunday morning in a tiny town there in Sutherland Springs, Texas, about 30 miles southeast of San Antonio. And I want to bring in again former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis, who we have on the phone. Officer Chief Davis, I beg your pardon. Again, this is happening at around 11:30 in the morning Central Time while the parishioners there are in church. Mass is in progress. And we now have, according to Brian Yennis' reporting, that some of the parishioners heard the shooter reload multiple times. And we also just showed video of the parishioners coming out of the church after this mass shooting. Looking at the demographics of the church parishioners there, I'm not sure if you were able to see those pictures as well, Commissioner Davis, but based on the information that we are seeing and the information that we are hearing from early reports from eyewitnesses, what can you glean as to what's happening?
Well, I think the most important issue here is that this is a classic case of a soft target. This is a group of people who have come together to worship. There's a small crowd in a small room, and usually not armed. So you're going to have a suspect come in with what's been described as the ability to reload numerous times without knowing what kind of weapon he was using. It appears as though these individuals were just targets. There was just a large number of people, and one person could really cause a lot of damage in a room like that. It's hard to say just from the demographics of the church. There could be several motivations here. It's not, the FBI is involved in this, but they have an office in San Antonio. I was just with Chief McManus from San Antonio last week. I'm sure that he has resources out here. It's only 40 miles to a big city. But right now, you really have to wait. This could be motivated by any number of things. And we just have to wait to get a sense to see the identity of the shooter, to find
Absolutely.
out what background
Commissioner
there is.
Davis, stand by for me as we take this hard break, and we're back in a moment.
This afternoon, there has been a shooting just outside of San Antonio. Sutherland Springs, the First Baptist Church there. According to the Associated Press, according to the sheriff's office, multiple people have been killed, shot and killed during the service this morning at 11:30 Central Time in that church. About 50 parishioners inside when police say the suspect, an armed man, walked in and just started shooting. We're told that several children have been wounded, including a 2-year-old. We do not know the age or conditions of some of the other people, but there are now reports of multiple fatalities from the shooting this morning. Here is a woman who was a witness at the church speaking about this horrendous tragedy earlier today.
I've been going to this church since I was knee-high to a duck. Yeah. So it's pretty tragic. Really don't know. I'm about in the dark as everybody because I changed my mind to go to church today, and so did my daughter. Otherwise, we'd be there.
Right now, authorities do not know the identity, or they're not publicly releasing the identity of the suspect. There is no known motive. They don't know if this was an intended target. They don't know if this was a potential domestic dispute, a terrorist attack, or religious hate crime. Ted Williams, detectives, also criminal defense attorney, joins us on the phone. Ted, it really is far too early to speculate in that way, but you know, it's a Sunday morning, small town, and not a major soft target like a terrorist attack. Ted, are you there?
Well, Eric,
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, was that question for me?
this is for Ted Williams, but I believe that is the voice of former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis. Is that who I'm hearing right now?
That's correct. I'm
Okay,
still with you.
well,
Yep.
Commissioner Davis, we'll go with you. We just got reports from our Brian Yennis that the ATF Houston Field Division officers are on scene, as well as the San Antonio ATF Division officers. Again, we also have reports that some of the eyewitnesses heard the shooter reload multiple times. It is a small community of about 400 people. Those pieces that we do know, how do those pieces begin to put together the puzzle of this mass shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas?
Well, the arrival of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms is extremely important to these cases. They bring a wealth of special expertise about firearms. They're very helpful in putting together the crime scene and helping track down the weapons that are involved to get some sense as to where the suspect purchased the weapons and the ammunition that he used to attack this church. The FBI would naturally send people to a case like this. You can't draw anything from that at this point in time, unless there is an announcement that the FBI has taken over the investigation. That would be a whole different ball game if that happened. But right now, it's still very much a response phase, and I think one of the things that you have to remember, when you get 40 or 50 miles outside of a major city and you're in a rural location like this, you get one or two police officers that respond to this scene. Sometimes their backup is 15 or 20 minutes away. So it's hard to tell exactly what happened here. But the fact that the police were able to stop this assault so quickly, I think, is that's going to be a very interesting part of the story.
Very much part of the story. Commissioner Davis, if you would stand by for me, I want to reset the scene here on this breaking news happening out of near San Antonio, Texas. There has been a mass shooting that we're reporting here on this Fox News alert happening this Sunday morning at a small church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, which is about 30 miles southeast of San Antonio. A very small congregation. We're told 50 people or so in mass at the time when reports of a lone gunman walking into this mass at 11:30 this morning Central Time in Texas, opening fire on parishioners who were there worshiping on this Sunday morning.
The Associated Press, quoting the sheriff's office, says that yes, there are multiple people who have been killed in this mass shooting, others wounded. There were about 50 people inside the church during the service when they say that suspect walked in and opened fire before he was, quote, taken down. Among the wounded, we're told, a 2-year-old and some other children. A horrific act among people of faith as they are celebrating life and faith. Ted Williams joins us now from a Washington, D.C. bureau. He is a former homicide detective and criminal defense attorney. Ted, it just really strikes at the heart of what this country is about, at the American spirit, at what we do, how we live our lives. And we've seen terrorist attacks in the past. We don't know what this is. We don't know, as I've said, if this is a domestic dispute, an act of hatred, a hate crime because of the religion, or a potential terrorist attack. But it is a mass shooting that, again, has claimed more innocent American lives.
Yeah, you know, Eric, I have been at mass shootings at San Bernardino. I was down at the Pulse nightclub there in Florida. And here we go again, unfortunately. And this is a rather soft target. And when our viewers look at a church, normally there's an entrance and maybe there's some back doors and everything. But if you can visualize this, these individuals, these parishioners, they were contained in this church, and it's not easy to get out of there. So they are really like sitting ducks in this church, unfortunately. And one of the good things that we've learned here is that the shooter is down. That's the first thing, and to get the injured to treatment right away, that's what law enforcement officers initially wanted to work on.
How do they start finding out the motivation of this? They clearly will start going through the background of who this is. They obviously would know him if he has some identity on him, or at least if he doesn't, you know, in terms of the type of motivation of this horrendous act.
Well, Eric, one of the things that they're definitely looking at here and talking to witnesses on the scene, that's very important, because some witness there on the scene may very well have recognized this individual. Or if they don't have any witnesses on the scene there, by now the feds there, meaning the FBI, ATF, and other law enforcement agencies. And I would think that by now they may clearly been able to identify the shooter. Now, at this stage, quite naturally, what they're doing, if they've been able to identify the shooter, is that they are moving to his residence if he's in that local community. So the big question that everyone has right now when you have these kind of mass shootings are, what was the motive? And that's what they're trying to determine at this stage.
Absolutely. And we have Texas Governor Greg Abbott tweeting our thanks to law enforcement for their response. And speaking of law enforcement, Detective Williams, you mentioned ATF. We do know that the ATF Houston Field Division as well as the San Antonio ATF officers are on scene. We have again reports of this shooter reloading multiple times, which will, I ask you, what does that tell you about the type of weapon that he perhaps used?
Well, he either had automatic, perhaps, or semi-automatic weapon. The fact that he was reloading this gun, it tells that he intentionally went in there wanting to kill or to harm as many people as he could, or many parishioners in that church. I've seen these kinds of shootings before where someone has a motive and they have a beef against somebody in the church, a domestic incident, etc. It's too early on at this stage to try to determine what was the motive behind this, but I think that the law enforcement officers will early on know. One of the concerns, and we all are concerned about this in America now, are terrorists. We do not know if this is terrorist related. It could very well be a domestic situation.
But Ted, wouldn't excuse me for interrupting, wouldn't multiple reports of deaths, of multiple deaths in this church indicate that it may not be a domestic dispute, that it could be a hate crime or a terrorist attack, as opposed to a gunman going after a former wife or this sort of thing, when you have multiple deaths reported during a church service?
Well, when you have multiple deaths like this, you're trying to determine, of course, Eric, the motivation of the individual who is the shooter. And it's too early on, because he may very well be a parishioner in that church who was thrown out of the church, and I'm speculating, of course, and at that stage went back in there and did a mass shooting, all because of hatred. He could be someone that is mentally impaired. We know what happened down in Carolina there.
In Charleston with
in Charleston, Carolina. Yeah. And so that person was motivated by race and hatred. We don't know at this stage, early stage, what the motivation is. It could be many, many things, Eric.
You're looking on the right of the screen at the First Baptist Church of South Sutherland, Texas, where this horrible massacre occurred earlier today during the 11:30 in the morning Central Time church service by people of faith who were gathered together to celebrate God and life, and instead it has become the latest mass shooting tragedy in a country upon which we've been so afflicted the past few years. It's just a horrendous thought, horrendous scene as investigators start to go into what the situation is. We have a quick interview with one of the witnesses.
We got called in the middle of our service down the road, and immediately the people that were my wife, who is a nurse at the hospital, local hospital, it went into action. We have a deputy that was in there that went into action along with other people. We got ready, and then we just did what we do. We prayed. And you know, the Bible tells us that we overcome evil with good. And not evil doesn't overcome evil. Evil can only be overcome by good. So we come together to do that immediately.
A Sunday morning American tradition, people of faith worshiping there in a small congregation in Sutherland Springs, Texas, comes to an end when a lone shooter walks in, opens fire, and shoots and murders people. We're back in a moment.
Tragedy in Sutherland Springs, Texas. The church on the right is scene of a massacre this morning, apparently. Reports of multiple deaths when a suspect walked into that church and opened fire. So much he, we are told, kept on reloading. President Trump, who was on his Asian trip, tweeting this, saying, quote, "May God be with the people of Sutherland Springs, Texas. The FBI and law enforcement are on the scene. I am monitoring the situation from Japan." Texas Governor Greg Abbott tweeting, "Our prayers are with all those who are harmed by this evil act. Our thanks to law enforcement for their response. This is the latest apparent mass shooting in our country. We do not know the identity of the suspect. We do not know his motivation, whether this was indeed a terrorist attack, a hate crime based on religion, or something that is just so inexplicable, such as we saw during the Las Vegas mass shooting of several weeks ago." Ted Davis is with us in the studio in Washington, D.C. Ted, your thoughts as we learn there are more and more apparent victims who have been killed in this type of attack?
You know, you wonder just what's going on here in America. People wake up on a Sunday morning, they put on the Sunday finery, and they're going to praise their God. They're sitting there doing in prayer, and all of a sudden, a gunman walks into the church and just starts opening fire. And not only opening fire, but continuing to open fire. It's a very chilling and scary situation, Eric, that these individuals were faced with. But I would have to believe that if it's some member of the community, by now there should be some identification of that person. If the person is outside the community, then it'll be a slightly more difficult for law enforcement to make an identification.
And what would that mean if the person was outside the community, that this was intentionally targeted potentially as a terrorist act?
Oh, absolutely. I won't go as far as to say a terrorist act, but anytime that you go into a church or a place of worship, a soft target like this, and open fire, it could very well be defined as a terrorist act. And it may not be international terrorism. It could very well be domestic in nature. But that's the scary thing. And when these things happen like this, on a Sunday like this, one of my greatest concerns as a former law enforcement officer is the copycats. We do realize that international terrorists, ISIS, for instance, they are watching this. And they take a footprint from this kind of a situation, and that is what makes it so scary for us in America during these kinds of situations.
Ted Williams, former D.C. homicide detective, also criminal defense attorney. Stand by if you would. I want to bring in now former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis. Commissioner Davis, I believe you said earlier that you were with San Antonio Police Chief McManus. Based on what we just heard from Detective Williams saying that this perhaps could be the footprint for wannabe copycat artists, if you will. What sort of challenge does this present to people like Chief McManus?
Well, you know, Chief McManus and the sheriff who is responsible for Sutherland Springs are facing the same kind of challenges that police across the country are facing. You've got people who are on the fringe. They're either they either have very serious mental health issues, or they have become radicalized. They have a vendetta or some type of a wish to get even with people, and quite frankly, it's easy for them to get the equipment necessary to create havoc. Last week we saw the use of a rental truck in a big city in downtown New York. The week before that, there was a sniper in a hotel raining shots down on a peaceful crowd of concert goers. And this week now, we've got a shooting in a church. It's early to tell what this is, but it's too early to tell exactly what motivated this. But for the police, it's about getting there quickly and stopping the individual from killing people. It's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. Then there's the rescue of the people who are there. So it's playing itself out over and over and over again. The question is, what can we as a society do to stop it?
And as we know, in this horrible situation, the weapon of choice is a gun, some sort of a gun. What is this going to, how will this impact what we report, what local gun shop owners will have to report when folks are coming in to make purchases or to pawn guns, to get guns out of pawn shops? What has to happen now? You know, we have this saying in New York, you see something, say something, but how does that command need to expand?
Well, I think that every time one of these incidents happens, there seems to be a process that we go through where people grieve. They send sympathy out to people. Then there's a bit of a back and forth between people who are stringent one way or the other on the gun issue, and then eventually it fades into the background and we move on, and then it happens again. So that cycle is going to repeat itself after this. The question is, when will someone come up with a solution to it? That's really what we're hoping for, and that kind of leadership is really necessary right now.
Well, Commissioner Davis, that is definitely a question that begs of answers as we cover this mass shooting once again on a Sunday morning at a small church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, just outside of San Antonio. Multiple wounds, people injured, and fatalities as well. We continue our coverage.
It's devastating for us and for our community, but God's still in control.
It is a Sunday, and we are sadly reporting on an affront against God and our humanity. Another apparent shooting. Multiple people, reports say, killed as they were praying in church, attending the services this morning at 11:30 this morning in South Sutherland, Texas, about 40 miles east of San Antonio. At that church service this morning, the President of the United States, who's in Japan, tweeting, "May God be with the people of Sutherland Springs." Greg Abbott, the governor, saying our prayers are with all those who have been harmed by what he calls this evil act. There you see the president's tweet as he is on his 12-day, 5-stop Asian tour in Japan. It is a horror unfolding at this hour. A suspect, we are told, is dead. We do not have a motivation. We publicly do not have the identity of that suspect. But here are some of what some of the people earlier within the last hour told reporters when they spoke. Let's listen.
We got a call in the middle of our service down the road, and immediately the people that were my wife, who is a nurse at the hospital, local hospital, it went into action. We have a deputy that was in there that went into action along with other people. We got ready, and then we just did what we do. We prayed. And you know, the Bible tells us that we overcome evil with good. And not evil doesn't overcome evil. Evil can only be overcome by good. And so we come together to do that immediately.
No wrong. We leave our doors open. Our cars aren't locked. My car's running with the keys in it right now. I mean, we don't lock our doors out here, but why?
There aren't even words, are there?
No, there's no words. There's just, this happens in New York, in big cities. No one's safe. My dad's already taught me how to get the gun out of the safe and get them loaded. I mean, if it can happen here, guys, it can happen anywhere.
This happens in big cities like New York. We saw, of course, the radical Islamic terrorist attack that occurred in New York City just a few days ago that killed several foreign visitors as well as 2 young Americans, a 32-year-old and a 23-year-old in that atrocity. We've seen this in Las Vegas. We saw this in Charleston at the church in 2015 when Dylan Roof opened fire in a racially motivated act of hatred. We see something here again today, sadly. On this Sunday, 50 people in the church, reports of multiple people dead, others injured, including children, and we are also told, according to reports, a 2-year-old among the wounded.
A place of worship should be a safe haven, but it has happened again in a tiny town of about 400 people, Sutherland Springs, Texas, just southeast of San Antonio. This church, the First Baptist Church, was founded in 1926. Making it a bedrock there in that community, where you just heard one of the parishioners, one of the people in that community saying it should not happen here. We don't lock our doors. We know our neighbors. My keys are in my car right now as I sat inside of this church when this lone gunman walked in at about 11:30 a.m. Central Time this Sunday morning, walked in opening fire on some 50 parishioners there to worship on what should be a sacred Sunday morning in America. We have former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis on standby here. And Commissioner Davis, just a moment ago, we were talking about, I asked you how this changes or complicates the puzzle for people like San Antonio Police Chief McManus and the sheriff there in Sutherland Springs when it comes to surveying, because the weapon of choice in this mass murder, this multiple shootings with fatalities, the weapon of choice was a gun. So how can we survey the gun shops, the pawn shops, the places where people get these weapons that turn into, something that they use to commit mass murder?
Well, there are millions of weapons on the street and millions manufactured every year, and they're a durable product. They last for decades. So I don't know that. I think that the best thing, or the first thing that we can do in a situation like this is to somehow combine the records of people with mental health issues and the records of people who have firearms and make who are trying to get firearms, and make sure that there's some review of that. I mean, it just makes sense that when you see this attack in Las Vegas and the attack since then, especially the school shooting in Connecticut. I mean, there really has to be some common sense things that we can do to tighten things up, and but still maintain, the Second Amendment rights. So I think that those are the kind of conversations that we should be having after an incident like this. But the other thing is, who was the family of the shooter? Who was close to the shooter? There's always some people that have some inkling that something might be wrong, and I think that's another component of what we have to pay attention to.
Indeed, it is another component, and that exactly is where I was trying to go, Commissioner Davis. I wasn't trying to approach the Second Amendment rights by any means at this point in this horrible story. I just was talking about that very thing: see something, say something, talk to the people who, may have seen this lone shooter in the days and weeks leading up to this mass murder. Once again, here in a sacred place of worship in a church on a Sunday morning, happening in Sutherland Springs, Texas.
It impacts us all. As a family, we're a family. So what it does, it causes us to stop what we're doing, start to pray, and see how we can serve. And that's what you're seeing right here. This community is rallying around these folks, and so we're just going to try to do our best to comfort and minister how we can.
It impacts us all. They're one of the 50 parishioners at church this morning, thinking that it was a normal Sunday morning where you go to church, Mass, 11:30 Mass, already in progress, worshiping God, and then a lone shooter walks in, opens fire on the 50 parishioners inside of the church on this Sunday morning, happening at around 11:30 a.m. Central Time in Sutherland Springs, Texas, outside of San Antonio. The Vice President Pence just tweeting moments ago, Karen and I send prayers to victims and their families in Texas. We grieve with you and stand with resolve against evil. Thank you to first responders. And I want to bring into the conversation again Ted Williams, former D.C. homicide detective, criminal defense attorney. Detective Williams, I think you heard my conversation earlier with Commissioner Davis, former Boston Police Commissioner, and he was talking about the idea of comparing mental health records with records of those looking to purchase firearms. I wanted to get your take on that, and then we'll talk about some other things that I spoke to the commissioner about.
Well, you know, let me start off by saying I'm from small town America. I heard one of the persons interviewed said that they not anticipated, but that these things never happened in their communities. I'm from a small town, Lake Charles, Louisiana, and that's a neighboring state for Texas there. And in these states, there are all sorts of individuals with guns. Guns are there. It's a part of our everyday life. One of the tragedies is that we go into these incidents, there's this big gun debate one way or another about people with mental illness. We don't really know if there was a mentally ill person here. And then all of a sudden, we leave the debate and we wait for something else to happen. And that is the tragedy. I do agree with Ed Davis. If there are individuals out here who are mentally impaired or mentally ill, we should make it very difficult for them to not have guns. Now, that is not to take away from anybody who has Second Amendment rights to have a gun. So when you look at this small town here, you just cry for a small town where innocent people are going to worship, as you said out there, in a church. And now some of these innocent people are going to have to bury some of the people that they've been associated with in that church. It's a tragedy.
It's a tragedy happening in a small town of about 400 people. You mentioning, Ted Williams, that you are also from a small town, Lake Charles, Louisiana. I'm also from Louisiana. There are places where you know your people. We know each other's people.
Yes.
So one of the questions that they're going to be looking at, who is the family of this shooter? What will they be trying to find out in that regard?
Well, number one, if the person is, and the shooter is from the community, quite naturally, they're going to want to interview relatives if the person is from the community. And that is, they're going to want to try to find out if the person had a beef with somebody in the church. Was there something that drew him to that church to carry out this mass shooting? And when I say him, we don't know whether it's he or she at this stage. But we do know that if he's from that community, he's probably got relatives in that community. They will be able to tell us if he had some kind of, or she had some kind of mental infirmity. That's going to go a long ways. As you know, we just had the shooting out in Las Vegas, and we still, till this moment, don't know the motivation behind that shooting. And to bring some closure, you'll never bring closure to an act of this nature, but to bring some closure, individuals are going to want to know what motivated this person. Why would you go into a house of worship, a house of God, on a Sunday morning where little kids and their families are worshiping God, and open fire in that venue? And not only open fire, but then to reload and to continue to shoot people. What is the motivation? That's going to be something that's significant and important here in this whole process.
Let me just point out, the authorities do say it was a gunman, so they do believe it's a man and not a woman. And as you point out, Nikki Haley, our UN ambassador, said a church is the most sacred of places. No words.
Well, you know, Eric, you and I, through the years, have covered these shootings, and it doesn't get any easier. It's a tragedy. This gunman, that we know that it was a gunman, Why? Why would you do this? And so there are a lot of people in that community. They're going to galvanize and coalesce around each other, and they're going to be strong in that community. But what I'm concerned about, again, is not only this community, but communities all over our country where on Sunday morning, men and women dress their children, go into the church to worship their God, and then to have something like this to happen in one of the most sacred of sacred places.
It is indeed unthinkable. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas tweeting, keeping all harmed in Sutherland Springs in our prayers and grateful for our brave first responders on the scene.
Following this horrendous news out of South Sutherland, Texas, the church there you see in the upper right of your screen, the target of a horrible attack during the services this morning. Authorities say multiple have been killed, others wounded, including children, among them a 2-year-old toddler, when a gunman walked in during the 11:30 services at that Baptist church and opened fire during the services. There are no words for this type of horrendous tragedy that has scarred our country yet again in the wake of other church shootings. The Las Vegas massacre just over 1 month ago. It apparently has happened again. The gunman, police say, has been shot dead. There is no public identity of that gunman yet. We do not know a motive. We don't know if this is indeed a terrorist act, a hate crime against a religion, some type of domestic dispute. But multiple people dead would indicate some type of terrorist motivation, whether it is international or domestic. Brian Yennis has been following with some of the latest from our newsroom. Brian, what do you got?
Hi, Eric. Well, we're now getting more information about the victims. We now know that 10 victims were transported to Connolly Medical Center. They were transported there by ambulance. This hospital is 18 minutes southwest of Sutherland Springs. The hospital says that they had to airlift one victim that arrived at that hospital to a hospital in San Antonio. We've called other hospitals, but we do know that Connolly Medical Center is a level 4 trauma hospital. Level 4 is actually limited. Level 1 trauma hospital would be the hospital that could deal with the most severe of injuries. We know that Connolly Hospital Medical Center is the closest hospital to that Baptist church, so it would make sense that many of the victims who could be transported by ambulance would go there. But in terms of the most severe of wounds, we know that the better hospitals to deal with that are 2 hospitals in San Antonio. That would be the San Antonio Military Center, that is actually described as the Army's premier medical institution. We know that they are a level 1 trauma center, and we also know that the other hospital would be University Hospital, which is a level 1 or 2 hospital in San Antonio. We've reached out to both hospitals, and they've been able to give us no comment. The only hospital that has been able to speak to us right now is Connolly Medical Center. Again, they have treated close to 10 people. They've gunshot wounds. One victim has had to be sent via airlift to a San Antonio hospital. Other victims were transferred. I don't have a number as to how many were transferred to other hospitals in San Antonio. That is the latest that we have in terms of how the situation right now. We know that those victims that arrived at Connolly Medical Center arrived at just after noon time. We know that the shooting took place at about 11:30.
You know, you have to understand, you look at that church, it's a rather small building, and as was noted earlier, the people in this type of situation, horrible to say they're just targets. If they're not armed, they're there. In the middle of a service, we're told that the gunman apparently had enough time to reload and continue his targeting of the victims there. Reports say multiple have been shot dead in this horrendous attack, and no word yet on the suspect or motive at this moment. Certainly just another case of the sad, tragic news that we've had to endure as Americans in the wake of these type of incidents.
Sad, tragic news. Indeed, Eric, it has gripped us. It has captivated us in the most horrific of ways. You have House Speaker Paul Ryan tweeting, reports out of Texas are devastating. The people of Sutherland Springs need our prayers right now. We have been reporting on this mass shooting on a Sunday morning, a sacred morning in America, an especially sacred morning in tiny town USA, there in Sutherland Springs, a home to about 400 people. This church, First Baptist Church, is a bedrock in that community, founded in 1926. Total members, I'm told, 267. It is where people, as we just heard one of the parishioners who was there when this lone gunman came in and opened fire at 11:30 a.m. Central Town, where one of the people said that we don't even lock our doors. In fact, my keys are in my car right now. Multiple fatalities, multiple injuries happening in Sutherland Springs, Texas. We are covering this breaking news story here on the Fox News channel. We will continue to cover this. We have some law enforcement specialists standing by with where this investigation is now and where it will be heading in the weeks and months to come. Stay right here as we continue to report on this unfolding story here on the Fox News channel, as tragedy has struck the heart of America once again with a Sunday morning shooting, a lone gunman who has now been killed by law enforcement. Enforcement agents on the ground. We're not sure exactly how he died, but we'll have those details.